All right, everyone. Amanda, if you can move on to the next slide, please. Welcome, everyone, to the Housing Equity, Fair Housing, and Equal Access Training. Thank you all for being here today. My name is Cassie Auerland. I'm the COC manager with H3. My preferred pronouns are she, her, and hers. I also just want to mention that we've got Shelby Ferguson, the CES case manager, and she's on the line as well. So we're all here today because we're required by HUD and state law to comply with all applicable civil rights laws, including the non-discrimination and equal opportunity requirements in the Fair Housing Act. In addition, our COC requirements in our COC ESG written standards require that all programs are to not discriminate against a program participant when providing services. And one of our 3 guiding principles is equity. Contra Costa believes that everyone should have an equal opportunity to housing regardless of their race, ethnicity, gender identity, sex, and sexual orientation. So to talk about all of this today, we've got Melissa, Amanda, and Erica from Home Base, and we've got Melanie, Darius, and Will from Bar High. So I'm going to kick it off to them to start our training.
Great. I think that means we're up first. Hi, everybody. I'm Melanie Newcomb with Bar High. We're the Coalition of Public Health Departments of the Bay Area. My pronouns are she, hers, and I'm the membership liaison, which means I'm the person that connects our members to our programs and helps get people into our network. I'm joined by my colleagues Will Dominy and Darius Young, who I'll let introduce themselves.
Hi everyone, I'm Will Dominy. I use he and his pronouns, and I manage our housing work at Bar High.
Hello everyone, my name is Darius Young, and I use he and him pronouns, and I'm the Health Equity Policy Manager.
So,
excuse me.
Thank you, Will and Darius. Really briefly, I'll give you some background on Bar High. Our mission is to transform public health practice for the purpose of eliminating health inequities using a broad spectrum of approaches that create healthy communities. What does that mean? We are a coalition of the health departments that focus on the things that are health outside of the doctor's office. That means everything that affects you, the social determinants of health, everything that affects you from where you live to racism and sexism to climate change, all of those things that have an access to housing, which we'll be talking about a lot today, all of those things that have a major impact on your health that aren't necessarily what you would traditionally think of as health related. Like I said, we're a coalition of the health departments. We're the 9 counties that most people associate with the Bay, as well as Santa Cruz, and Berkeley has its own health department. We were formed from a bunch of health officers way back when. We've been around for almost 20 years now. And we try to do our best to bring a regional approach to all these health injustices.
Hello, everyone. My name is Melissa Hong. My pronouns are she and her. I'm a staff attorney at Home Base. Home Base is a nonprofit that provides technical assistance to the Contra Costa continuum of care. We work on the local, state, and national level to support communities in addressing homelessness. I'm joined today by my colleagues Amanda Weirman and Erica Sao, who will be helping with moderating and logistics of the training. Erica's going to say a quick hello in case you need any tech support.
Hi everyone, my name is Erica. I use she, her, or they, them pronouns, and I just dropped my number in the chat. So feel free to message that number or direct message me if you're having any issues with Zoom throughout the conversation. And yeah, looking forward to a great training. Nice to meet you.
This next slide shows our agenda for today's training. We do have a lot to get through in the 2.5-hour time. The training is really designed to be interactive, as we will be asking for your active participation in a couple activities, including 2 separate small breakout sessions where we'll be splitting you up into smaller groups via Zoom. As well as answering discussion questions throughout the training, whether that be with a larger group or in the chat. On the agenda here, you'll see that the first 30 minutes, we will cover core concepts regarding housing equity. There will be a short breakout session here. After that, we'll take a deep dive into both the fair housing laws and the equal access laws. We will have a 5-minute break at 2:05 in case anyone needs a bathroom break or a snack break. After that, we will be discussing the laws themselves. And we'll have a discussion after that regarding tools to disrupt bias and discrimination, including H3's commitments and process around equity. And we'll let you know what happens when people don't follow the law and how to intervene with clients, coworkers, and organizations. After that will be our main small group breakout session, where once again, you'll be randomly assigned to a small group of 4 to 6 people. And you'll walk through and do a role play of different scenarios involving either fair housing or equal access. And these are meant to be, situations that could arise in your day-to-day work. That activity will take around 30 minutes. And then finally, we will conclude by asking you to think about what your personal commitments are in implementing the material that you've learned in the training. Just to go over some Zoom logistics, as a reminder, please do keep yourself on mute throughout the training, unless you're answering a question or asking a question, and of course, unmute yourself during the breakout sessions. And then feel free to use the chat feature throughout the training to ask any questions that you may have, and we'll try to address them. And then just to give you a heads up, there will be a couple polls throughout the training just to evaluate as an evaluation for the training. That first one will be next. So you should see a poll pop up on your screen. If you can take a minute to just click your answer for that poll, please. Great, I think we're just waiting on a few more people to answer the poll question. It should have popped up on your computer screen. And Erica's saying you have 20 seconds left to vote. Great, thank you. And I'll hand it over to Will, who will go over core concepts in housing equity.
Thank you, Melissa. Hi, everyone. Again, Will Domini with Bar High. We wanted to, so we're going to dive really deep on a couple of the laws that regulate housing today. But before we did that, we want to start by really grounding in the concepts of equity that are behind those laws. and put those laws in context. So I'm going to do just a quick presentation around how we think about that within Bar-High, and we come from a public health perspective on that. So next slide. Public health is often really nerdy, and so we start these conversations with data. And because we're really focused on health inequities, we start these conversations with some really heavy data. So can anyone describe what they see on this map here, or what you take from it? Don't be shy. It's going to be a very participatory conversation, hopefully. So
Wow.
Just jump in. Wow, yes.
Pretty much tells us, depending on what area you live, you're most likely to either live longer or die younger.
Yeah, so this map of census tracts or neighborhoods in the Bay Area shows life expectancy. And you can see that, as you said, where you live really determines the kind of, it doesn't determine how your life is going to be, but it determines the risks that you face. And what we know from the data is that there's about a 25-year difference in life expectancy by neighborhood. I was hanging out, I just had a kid, and I was hanging out with my child's grandmother earlier today, and just thinking about how lucky I am that she gets to spend that time, help us with childcare. And one of the ways that we understand this data sometimes is that 25 years, that difference of where you live is the difference between getting to spend time with your grandchild as they grow up or not, just to ground that number in our daily lives. If you could go to the next slide. And these are statistics, but we never want to divorce them from our everyday lives, because this is California, this is the Bay Area, this is how we're actually doing. Can someone say what they see on this slide or what they take from this slide?
Despite that the death rates have declined in California, the rate in African Americans have not, and it actually has increased than compared to other racial or ethnic groups.
Yeah, so you know, while we're making progress over time, the difference by race in California for death rates remains very persistent. So despite all the things that we've been trying to do over the last number of decades, we still see these really persistent inequities by race. And that's going to be a focus of what we talk about today. Not those death rates necessarily, but some of the housing conditions that inform some of those rates. So if you'd go to the next slide. So we're going to take just like 2 minutes really quickly in groups of 4 to discuss these questions, and Erica will chat the questions into the chat so you have them. And the questions are, do you see yourself, your family, your community, or the folks that we serve in these statistics? And then the second part of it is, what do you think causes these inequities? So go to your breakouts. We'll see you in 2 minutes.
Well, welcome back, everyone. We should be closing that breakout session now.
Great. Thanks, Erica. Okay, so I know in my group we had a really lively conversation, and I want to see if just a couple people want to share out some of what you talked about in your small groups.
I think that one of the things in my group was that we all work in lower income neighborhoods, you know, like Richmond, West Oakland. I work in Antioch. But I work 4 blocks from the worst part of Antioch, you know, so it's that plays a huge part in health, wealth, and mentally and physically and financially. That's what we discovered, we talked about.
Anyone else?
I think also looking at these communities, like if we look at Antioch, for example, or the East County, And we see that they had that red marker indicating people passing in their mid-late 60s and early 70s. And like, what workforce lives out there, or what health center built recently, from Kaiser to others. And, you know, those are the folks, even if we look about our infrastructure of traffic, right? These are the folks commuting to work somewhere else, and what stress that puts on their bodies, you know, and just some things like that. Again, you know, what are the eating habits there? What has changed since 2002? What's been available? And kind of, you know, and these are the communities we're serving. So.
Yeah, totally. So if you'd go to the next slide, Erica. I think you all already started to name this, but I wanted to just give a quick preview of kind of how we think about this at Bar-High. And this slide is the Bar-High framework. This is something we put out quite a while ago now, but it's been really picked up kind of in public health practice. And it's how we think about the drivers behind those inequities, and also a model for how we get to change and how we address those inequities. So on the far right-hand side, you see mortality and diseases and injury. So that's what we're trying to address, right? That's the drivers of those inequities. And traditionally in health and in public health, we've focused on treating those directly. So, you know, we focus on the doctor's office and clinics. We've also focused on, you know, case management and addressing people's kind of risk behaviors. So, you know, we're the folks in public health that brought the world seatbelts or smoking cessation campaigns or vaccines. And all of that stuff is incredibly important, like very, very important. But what we've seen is it hasn't actually closed the gaps by race or by neighborhood or by income in how people are actually doing, and in their mortality, their diseases and injury. So we've started looking, what we talk about is like further upstream, and looking at living conditions. And this is what a lot of you were already naming. This is what came up in my small group. So things like, what kind of housing do you have? What kind of neighborhood do you live in? What do you have access to? What's the school your kid's going to? What's your immigration status? And how does that impact the fear that you might be facing, or the services that you have available to you? So that's the set of things that really shapes on the day-to-day people's lives. What we see is that those things didn't come out of nowhere, and that those living conditions, and especially the inequities in those living conditions, were the result of decisions usually that folks in government and sometimes in other institutions made, right? So I was trained as an urban planner, and a lot of the decisions that we made in the urban planning field about where a highway goes or what kind of housing we build in a city, that really shapes the kind of access that folks have in their communities. And then if you go to the farther, like the far further side, we've got things like race, class, immigration status, et cetera. And our society is set up to really structure opportunities around those things. And we see that racism, for instance, has been baked into a lot of our institutions. Or later, we'll talk about transphobia and homophobia, and how those things have been baked into our institutions. And whether or not, unfortunately, whether or not we are still trying to do that, because a lot of our institutions were formed during times where there was really explicit racism or explicit homophobia, we tend to reproduce those patterns unless we're really careful to be like, no, we're making a different decision today. Let's go in a different direction. So next slide. And Darius and I are going to spend just a second kind of making that concrete and talking about what that's looked like in housing by race. So Darius, take it away.
So for me, I was born of parents whose families migrated from the South to the Bay Area for the war industry jobs. And they were able, their parents, although they did not own a house, my mother's father's family, they were able to rent a house in West Oakland. My father's family, they more or less became settled in Berkeley, California, where they were able to eventually buy a home. Some opportunities opened up in the mid-'60s with certain legislation such as the Fair Housing Act, of which we will talk about, that allowed us to move into a neighborhood and to actually buy a home. However, those things did not translate into the next generation, which was me and my siblings, because we know that through legislation and different type of setbacks, those opportunities began to decline, which up until this point, I have not been able to purchase a home. As a matter of fact, out of 5 siblings, I only have 1 sibling that was able to purchase a home. So that's where we are at now. We hit a peak, and now we're back to in the same place that we were prior to the legislation.
Thanks, Darius. And my family's had a really different trajectory. So we can trace our ancestry back to some of the first colonizers of this country, in particular, this guy, George Soule, who was an indentured servant. So he came here as not a free person, but was able to get his freedom in exchange for serving in the military, basically, and participating in the genocide of the Pequot tribe in what is now Massachusetts. And in exchange, he was freed and then got like free land that was, stolen from the native folks there. My family, from then was kind of like working and middle class. My grandfather served in World War II and was able to benefit from the GI Bill, both to go to college and then to be able to buy a home. And when he died, when my grandparents died, we used the money that was in that home. It paid for part of my college education, which then for me kind of set me on more of a middle class trajectory. When I moved to Oakland like 12 years ago or so, and I wasn't targeted by the cops. I was able to move in at a time that a lot of Black folks and others were moving out, were being gentrified out, displaced to Contra, Costa County, Solano County. My partner owns our home. I've been able to buy into it a little bit. And I now have a kid, and I'm hoping that, in time, I'm going to be able to leave that house to my kid. And I'm really aware that, the money in that, the wealth there is not the result of things that I've done necessarily. That's been the result of kind of those decisions along the way, those policy decisions that have made it easier for my family to accumulate that wealth. And if you'd go to the next slide. We're not going to spend a long time on this, but I wanted you to have it in the slides. This is just like a more kind of scholarly version of that history of looking, across groups and making some generalizations. But for white folks and for Black and African American folks, what are some of the policy decisions that have really shaped the kind of access that families like Darius's and mine have had over time? And if you'd click a click, Erica. Darius mentioned the Fair Housing Act came in the 60s and really did shape for a period of time and continues to shape how those inequities or equities have kind of played out. The one other thing I would say is just like we've chosen to focus on our stories because Darius and I are white and Black, and because racism in America has had a particularly intense impact on Black folks around housing. Like anti-Black racism in housing is very, very strong. But we could have looked at this amongst other racial groups as well and seen really different kinds of stories. So we don't want to conflate everything just to Black and white, but that's who we are as a team, and that's who, in some ways, housing has had a really strong impact on white folks and Black folks. Next slide. And we can see that when we look at the data around homelessness. So this is some data from All Home, looking at the PIT counts regionally. And what you can see is that Black people are way overrepresented, 5 times more than the general population in terms of who's homeless in the PIT counts. And then Indigenous folks, it's 12 times regionally. And if you go to the next slide, we can zoom, one back. We can zoom in on Contra Costa County. And it's a little small for me to read right now, but, sorry, what does PIT mean? That's the point in time counts, which are the annual counts of who is homeless every year. So that's some of the data. It's imperfect data, but it's some of the data we use to assess kind of how we're doing around homelessness. And what you'll see if we zoom in on Contra Costa is that there's about a 4 times disparity for Black people and a 24 times disparity for Indigenous people. And I want to just like pause and let that sink in, both of those numbers, that 4 times, and then particularly for Indigenous people, like these are the folks whose land that we're on and are 24 times less likely to have a roof over their head. Next slide. Over to you, Darius.
So in this slide, we'll see, we treat homelessness as an individual and behavior issue for intervention. The impact of institutional and structural racism in education, criminal justice, housing, employment, healthcare, and access to opportunities cannot be denied. Homelessness is a byproduct of racism in America. This comes from the Los Angeles Homeless Service Authority report and recommendations of the Ad Hoc Committee on Black People Experiencing Homelessness. Next slide. So we have actually seen, where we have been, where we were, but this gives us a picture of where we're headed. So what you see on the ground is this Black Lives Matter painted on the ground, and this is in Martinez, California, and this was taken shortly after some of the protests that erupted behind the death of George Floyd of Minneapolis, which I'm quite sure most of you are aware of. And what this shows us is that, we are now headed to a point where people are like not content on being where we're at. They're not content. And so we're in this season, what I call it, and hopefully it's a long season of like change. And so the question becomes, how can we help, all of us help to create the change that we're looking for to bring equity into race issues and to eliminate some of the things that have been those practices that have held people back in the past because of race, gender, and ethnicity. Next slide. So we are getting ready at Bar High to launch and promote a program, and it's our action lab that is going to be addressing anti-Black racism and racial disparities in the Bay Area homelessness. So, we would like as many people that want to be able to participate and sign up for this, and you can do so by filling out by following the link that we will post up to show you how you can get involved and attend some of the listening sessions, the planning sessions that we have charted out. Thank you.
Just one other thing I would add on that, Darius, is that that's a program that we're launching alongside Home Base and then All Home California and the Federal Reserve Bank. But the 2 sets of organizations that are training you today are really core of planning it. So we're really excited to be launching it and would love it if you're interested. And Erica put the link in the chat. Next slide.
So this gets us at a topic. Oh, Melanie Newcomb again, she, her pronouns. This gets us at a topic that we've kind of danced around and mentioned, but haven't been explicit about, which is intersectionality. Intersectionality is the way that different identities come together and interact to lead to different disparities that lead to different ways that people are as a whole person. So this is a picture of Sylvia Rivera. Sylvia Rivera was one of the founders of what is thought of as the current Pride movement for LGBT folk. She specifically worked with trans youth, with sex workers, with poor and incarcerated queer people. This quote kind of sums up what a good summary of intersectionality. No pride for some of us without liberation for all of us. We're in it together, and all of our identities play together to build who we are. So just to do some quick terminology, which will definitely come into play later, but is worth knowing now, cisgender is a person who identifies and has gender expression of the sex they were assigned at birth. Transgender is someone who does not identify with their sex assigned at birth. We'll come back to that later. Like I said, Sylvia Rivera was a trans person of color. So she's a great example of this. How this interacts and plays out in the real world can be seen through almost any facet of society. So I bet a lot of you know about the statistic that women earn less on the dollar than men. I think this current statistic is 79 cents per dollar. If you look at how that interacts with Black women, they make even less money than white women, and still less money than men. And all of that then compounds with how the criminal justice system looks at Black people and treats Black people. It leads to greater numbers of homelessness. It can lead to, for trans people, being forced into sex work because that's all that's accessible to them in employment. And all of that creates new conditions and new ways that all of those identities play together to lead to different outcomes. I think that's all I have for that slide.
So now we're going to talk a little bit about the Fair Housing Act. Next slide. So this person is named William Byron Rumford, and this is really, really personal to me, and I just feel honored to be able to present this slide. Having William Byron Rumford was from Louisiana. His family migrated to Berkeley, California, where he became a successful businessman, in that he owned a pharmacy in Berkeley, California. He was the first African-American elected official to office in Northern California. And he was a very, very extraordinary man. He successfully sponsored a measure in 1949 that ended segregation in California's National Guard. He also introduced legislation pertaining to fair trade, small business, child polio immunization, atomic energy conservation, and environmental pollution. So today, though, he's best remembered for the Rumford Act, bearing his name, was the Fair Housing Act. And what this did was it made, housing, redlining, and all those things that kept African Americans out of housing in California, it made that illegal. And his legislation went on, and you can flip the slide, to go on and set the stage for the eventual signing of the federal legislation for fair housing in 1968 by Lyndon Johnson. And so this is the picture of Martin Luther King, and he was shot to death in Memphis in 1968. And most people recall this, but what they don't recall was that just prior to him going to Memphis, he went to Chicago, Illinois to champion fair housing legislation and to end segregation in a northern city, might I add, for housing discrimination. And he was eventually, he was assassinated. And it was after his assassination that Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Fair Housing Act that went into law for all of America's cities, that made discrimination in housing, buying housing, renting, and all those things that kept African Americans out of housing illegal.
Thank you so much for that background, Darius. So now we will go into the actual details of the Fair Housing Act and all of the requirements that must be followed. The Fair Housing Act prohibits discrimination in renting or buying a home, obtaining a mortgage, seeking housing assistance, or engaging in any other housing-related transaction. So how that applies to recipients of federal financial assistance, this does apply with homelessness programs, transitional housing, permanent supportive housing, public housing, voucher programs, and other affordable housing programs. So who are the groups that are protected under the Fair Housing Act? The Fair Housing Act explicitly prohibits discrimination based on someone's race, color, religion, their sex, familial status, which includes families with minor children and pregnant women, as well as national origin and disability. In addition to these specific groups that are laid out, other groups may also enjoy Fair Housing Act protections based on their historical relationship with a named protected class. So for example, those who are LGBTQ, although that's not explicitly written in the Act, they may be protected under sex discrimination, which includes discrimination based on nonconformity with gender stereotypes. Another example is persons with limited English proficiency. So HUD has stated that this is very closely tied with somebody's national origin. So it would be considered discrimination if you're discriminating on the basis of the fact that somebody has limited English proficiency. And a final example is survivors of domestic violence who often face housing discrimination, such as being denied admission or being evicted due to violence committed against them. Since domestic violence survivors are overwhelmingly women, they also may be protected under the Fair Housing Act due to sex discrimination. And any policies or practice that discriminate against one's status as a domestic violence survivor likely violates the Fair Housing Act. This next slide talks about liability for discriminatory housing practice. So a provider, such as the organizations that are in attendance today, could be either directly liable for a person's conduct or vicariously liable. So I'll go into what each of those means. There could be direct liability for one's own conduct that results in discriminatory housing, or if they fail to take prompt action to correct and end discriminatory housing practice by a person's employee or agent. Or a third category is also failing to take prompt action to correct and end a discriminatory housing practice by a third party, where the person knew or should have known of the discriminatory conduct and had the power to correct it. So not only are you liable for your own discriminatory conduct, for the conduct of your employees or your agent, but you can also be liable for the conduct of a third party where you knew or should have known of the discriminatory conduct and you had the power to correct it, but you didn't. For vicarious liability, with respect to the conduct of your agent or your employees, you would be vicariously liable for this even if you didn't know or know about the conduct that resulted in discriminatory housing practice. So it doesn't matter whether you know about the conduct or not. If your employee or agent did make a discriminatory practice, then you would be vicariously liable for that activity. This slide talks about the different forms of discrimination. Taking any of the following actions because of a protected class is illegal. This includes refusing to rent housing, refusing to negotiate for housing, making housing unavailable or denying that housing is available, and then setting different terms, conditions, or privileges for the rental of housing, using different criteria or applications or rental standards and procedures. Also, if you advertise in a discriminatory way. In addition, harassing a person because of their protected class is a form of discrimination. And then finally, threatening, coercing, or intimidating anyone because they are trying to exercise their fair housing rights or assisting others in exercising those rights is considered discrimination, as well as if you retaliate against a person who has filed a fair housing complaint or assisted with investigation. With respect to harassment, there are two types that have been codified in the rule. The first type is quid pro quo harassment, and the second type is hostile environment harassment. So the first type, quid pro quo harassment, is an unwelcome request or demand that makes submission to a request or demand a condition of accessing or maintaining housing because of a protected characteristic. So the most common example of quid pro quo harassment is sexual harassment. For hostile environment harassment, this includes unwelcome conduct that is sufficiently severe or pervasive, such that it interferes with accessing or maintaining housing, including the use or enjoyment of a dwelling. So a single incident of harassment can violate fair housing if it's pretty severe. And harassment does not require physical contact. It can include written, verbal, and other conduct as well. Just to go back to the last slide for a second. So with respect to harassment, it's important that programs make it clear through their policies that there is a strict no harassment policy. As a reminder, providers should ensure that other residents do not harass other residents on the basis of a protected class, such as someone's race or religion. So the provider does have a duty to step in if there is, harassment from another resident. The Fair Housing Act also prohibits discrimination that would result in disparate impact. This means that, you don't actually have to intend to discriminate, but if your policy or procedure results in a discriminatory impact, then you can also be violating the Fair Housing Act. So what is disparate impact? It could be a policy or practice that can be discriminatory even if the provider did not intend it to be. Also, it's a policy that appears to be neutral, but could be considered discriminatory if it has a harsher impact on people who are in a protected class. So some examples of this is a policy such as having a no curry permitted in apartments policy. This would have a disproportionate impact on South Asians. Also, a policy like no one can play outside would have a disproportionate impact on families with children. And then the last example is a policy that says no renting to people with criminal history. That likely would have a disproportionate impact on race or national origin. To further highlight the disparate impact example, although in the Fair Housing Act, persons with criminal records are not considered a protected class, it also might be considered discriminatory impact if they do have if a provider does have a policy that says that anybody with a criminal history cannot be admitted into the program. However, if a housing provider has a criminal history restriction on housing and there is no substantial, legitimate, non-discriminatory justification, these restrictions most often adversely affect a protected class. So people with criminal history might be affected because it disproportionately impacts a certain racial group. One exception to that rule is that a housing provider can exclude a person convicted of illegal manufacture or distribution of a controlled substance, even if that policy does have a discriminatory effect. So it's important to note that the person must be convicted of this, convicted of manufacturing or distributing, not for possessing a controlled substance. And also to note, if a provider does exclude a person with a disability who has a conviction related to distribution, but not other people with that conviction, then the provider violates fair housing because they're discriminating on the basis of a person with a disability. So the Fair Housing Act also prohibits discrimination on the basis of one's disability. So this section will go over that and what a reasonable accommodation is. There's a couple other laws besides the Fair Housing Act that protect individuals with a disability. These include Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, which applies to any program receiving federal funding, including subsidized housing, and also the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, which applies to program or activities provided by public entities and services of public accommodation. So it's important to remember that even if for some reason your program is not covered by one of these laws, that there are other laws that serve to protect individuals with a disability, and they work in tandem together to protect those individuals. And it's more than likely that one of these laws will apply. So what is considered a disability? The definition of a disability is having a physical or mental impairment which substantially limits one or more major life activities. So actually having that physical or mental impairment, or having a record of such impairment. So you might have had a disability in the past, but you don't currently have that. An example of that is a person is denied access to a program because of previous hospitalization for mental illness, even if that person does not currently have that mental illness. And the last category is someone who is regarded as having such impairment, even if they don't have a disability. So one might mistakenly believe that somebody has autism and they're discriminated against because of that belief. And even if that person doesn't actually have autism, it's still considered discrimination because somebody perceived that person to have that disability. So what are the steps that providers must take to address and comply with these disability laws? First, providers cannot deny an individual based on his or her disability if that person is otherwise qualified for the program. Second, providers must also ensure that their programs are physically and programmatically accessible to individuals with disabilities. And they also must remove all architectural barriers. For example, they should install grab bars for those that have mobility impairments, or making sure that their doors and walkways are wide enough to fit individuals with wheelchairs. They also must make their programs accessible, for example, by providing auxiliary aids to ensure communication is accessible by persons with disabilities. And then finally, they must also make reasonable accommodations to its rules, policies, and procedures. and reasonable modifications in physical structures to ensure that somebody with a disability has equal access to the services, programs, or activities. Reasonable accommodation could be a change in policy or practice or services, and there should be a connection between the accommodation and the disability. And it should be necessary in order for that person to use and enjoy a dwelling and related service. So generally, it's the responsibility of the client to ask for a reasonable accommodation, but that request doesn't necessarily have to be formal. It doesn't have to be in writing, and they don't actually have to use the actual term reasonable accommodation. In speaking with clients, it should be an interactive process. There should be a dialogue between the housing provider and the client to discuss what the proposed accommodation is and whether that's reasonable or not, or if there's a reasonable alternative. And if someone does make that request, it should be responded to promptly. There should not be unreasonable delay in responding to that request. Some limitations to reasonable accommodation and modification. A provider does not have to make a reasonable accommodation, or it would not be considered reasonable if any of these applied, including that it would cause undue financial or administrative burden. It would fundamentally alter the nature of housing, the housing provider services, or for some reason, if it caused a direct threat to health or safety of others, or if it caused a substantial physical damage to the property of others. So whether to, this slide discusses in what situations would it be okay for a provider to request documentation regarding a disability and the disability related need. So it really depends on how obvious the person's disability is and whether there is a clear connection between the disability and the requested accommodation. So the first part, if the person's disability is obvious or otherwise known, and the need for accommodation is clear, then you should not request any verification of the disability or the accommodation. So no need to request documentation there. The next one, if a person's disability is known, but the need for the accommodation is not clear, then only request the information necessary to evaluate the disability related need. For this one, an example would be a letter of verification from a doctor regarding the disability related need. And the last category, if neither the disability or the need is clear, ask for proof of both. You are allowed to ask for proof of both. So for example, if somebody with no obvious disability asks for a parking spot, then you can request verification that that person has a disability and that they need that parking spot because of the disability. And according to HUD, the documentation that can be requested, such as the letter from the doctor, it doesn't actually have to be from just a doctor. It can also be from another medical professional or another qualified third party who in their professional capacity has knowledge about the person's disability and the need for that accommodation. One common reasonable accommodation is somebody who presents themselves with a service animal or assistance animal. So there's two types of assistance animal. One type is a service animal, which if you look at the photo on the left-hand side, they're typically trained and it's usually a dog. And those who have service animals have additional protections under the Americans with Disabilities Act. And this is an exception to what I discussed earlier. If somebody does present themselves with a service animal, which is an animal that is trained to help them with their disability, you actually should not ask for documentation regarding either the disability or the qualifications of the animal. In contrast to that is another type of animal that provides assistance, which is an emotional support animal or other type of assistance animal. And these animals are not necessarily trained or certified, but they do help a client alleviate their symptoms of their disability or provide emotional support, well-being, comfort, or companionship. For emotional support animals, you are allowed to request documentation of their disability and the need for the animal to support with that disability. And we just have a few more slides before our break coming up. And I know there's been a lot of material thrown at you. Just as a reminder, we will be sending you the slides after the training. We have everyone's emails who registered, so we will also be emailing that to you as well. With regard to families, the definition of familial status under the Fair Housing Act is a person whose household includes one or more minor children who live with a parent, a person who has legal custody of a minor child, or the designee of a parent or legal custodian with written permission of the parent or legal custodian. So it also includes protections for pregnant women and any person who's in the process of securing legal custody for a minor child, including those that are trying to adopt or foster parents as well. So with respect to avoiding discrimination on the basis of familial status, providers cannot deny admission to or separate family members from other family members, from other members of their family based on the protected class under the Fair Housing Act. So just because, you know, a family has a minor child, you cannot separate that family or deny access to the program. In addition, providers cannot charge higher rent or security deposit to families with children, you know, separate and have different rules for those that are under 18 in the use of housing facilities, or require any per capita charges or per person fees. So any of those policies would be considered a violation of the Fair Housing Act on the basis of familial status. To kind of summarize this whole section, next couple slides, this first slide will talk about just overall best practices that providers can implement in ensuring that they are following fair housing rules. Providers should have clear and consistent processes that are applied equally to all. Decisions should be made based on factual and objective criteria, not subjective ones such as, you know, one's perception that that person is odd or has odd behavior. Any sort of termination should be based on documented violations. An example would be they destroyed the property. Providers should also ensure that employees follow written standards, policies, and procedures equally to all clients. And then just as a best practice, any sort of documentation related to applications or reasonable accommodations that are requested and the actions that are taken to accommodate those should be kept for at least 2 years, as well as any documentation regarding the fact that a client may have violated program rules and was therefore terminated. Some of the key takeaways in this section are that the Fair Housing Act protects against discrimination based on a protected class in housing transactions. And discrimination can be intentional or unintentional, but cause a disparate impact on a protected class. And discrimination can take many forms, including the denial of housing, setting different terms, policies, or criteria, or harassment or retaliation. And the best practice overall is to follow clear written procedures equally to all clients. So to close out this section, we have a couple questions for you to think about. Feel free to share out loud or write your responses in the chat. What aspects related to fair housing are most relevant in your line of work? And what are some of the most common examples of how the Fair Housing Act apply in your day-to-day work? Also, if you have any questions, feel free to let us know. Does anyone have any thoughts on these questions?
Well, this is Devon from Humanity Way. Thank you so much for the information. It was really informative.
Oh, you're welcome.
And in my line of work, which is placing people into housing, finding affordable housing options, this is really good, a really good reminder from us from an organizational and a programmatic standpoint to whether intentional or unintentional, make sure that we have control mechanisms in place and policies and procedures to ensure that property owners are not violating the rights of the people that we serve. So this is excellent information. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you so much for that comment. All right. Does anyone else have any thoughts? Feel free to also include them in the chat. All right. Well, thank you so much, guys. Feel free to continue to put your answers in the chat box. For now, we're going to pause for a 5-minute break. Feel free to, get up and stretch, use the bathroom. We'll see you back here in 5 minutes. All right, guys, welcome back, everyone. For our next topic, we're still waiting on people to return, but we're going to be diving into the equal access rule, and Melanie will be providing a bit of context for that.
Yeah, thank you. Like Melissa said, still Melanie, still she, her pronouns. So we wanted to give a little bit of a case example to explain why this is important and give some background on that. Do you mind switching the slide? We are going to focus again on transgender and queer people as our case example for this portion. We have the picture of Sylvia Rivera again, who's reminding us about intersectionality and all the pieces that are important there. So why is this important? Just when it comes to trans and gender nonconforming people, 20 to 40% of trans youth are homeless, which is not great. That number is not quite as high for trans adults, but still quite up there. We know that 1 out of 5 trans people are discriminated against when seeking homes, and about 1 out of 10 have been evicted for being transgender. All of those are not what we should be seeing, and like we mentioned earlier, based on its association with, well, after the case of Amy Stevens that passed this year in the Supreme Court, transgender protections are now linked with sex along with sexual orientation. So like they might not be directly protected classes under the Fair Housing Act, but in California and with the connection to sex as a protected class they are now. Personally, I'm transgender and I'm involved with a lot of transgender communities. I help people find housing through whatever, searching for apartments and things along those lines with my friends and people I know. I've seen discrimination just in that process, and a very informal process with talking to potential renters or landlords, I guess. Things along the lines of when they do a background research, finding that they lived under a different name that's gendered differently at their last housing, and then all of a sudden the communication goes silent. Or finding out that the 2 people trying to live in that apartment are both women and in a relationship, and that suddenly, again, going silent and not responding any longer to the requests. We've tried doing the opposite and starting with that information in the first emails, and we get much less responses. Even today, even with the more acceptance that's being gained, discrimination is still important or still happening, and it's important to recognize that it's happening. Next slide. Before we bombard you with all these topics, it's kind of important to get a grounding on them. We already talked about cisgender and transgender. I'll mention those a little more on the next slide to give you a little more background, but starting just with gender, it's the perceived, the societal perception of a person's sex. That comes with gender expression, how one dresses or acts, how people then classify how those people express or act. Gender identity, which is what you identify with, that may or may not match the sex you were assigned at birth. That's where trans people come from if you don't assign it. Gender identity can be really complex. It can be, we'll get there in a second. Perceived gender identity is what people then perceive based on how you present and your gender expression. That can be completely wrong based on how a person actually identifies. That can be completely different. And again, that can be what we traditionally think of as men, women, and non-binary people. Sex is the perceived distinction between male and female that is assigned to someone at birth based on their presentation of their genitalia. So it's important to note sex and gender are often conflated, but they are different things. Gender is the societal perception and sex is the biological portion. It's also important to note that most people think of sex as binary in the biological portion, but there's a lot of variation that goes into that. So while there's major classifications of male and female, which can be useful useful as reference points, they aren't actually fully descriptive, and lots of people slip through the cracks and are classified all over the board. That's not even getting into intersex people who can have ambiguous genitalia or genitalia that's mixed. That opens up a whole nother thing that most people just don't ever think about. So that's important to note, that sex isn't as simple as just male and female. When it comes to sexual orientation, it's something completely different. And we want to make sure that we make the note that those are completely different. A transgender person can be straight, gay, bi, pan, any sexual orientation you can imagine. People can be attracted to all different genders and sexes. So don't conflate the two. A trans person might be part of the LGBT umbrella, but they're not necessarily LG or B. And other things along those lines. So next slide. Digging more into trans terminology, we already identified transgender as people who have a than that assigned at their birth. Cisgender is the opposite, someone whose gender identity and expression match their assigned sex at birth. Cisgender is what's often considered normal. I wouldn't use the term normal, but that's the kind of what the default assumption for most people. That's not particularly helpful, but is often the way people think. Trans people often undergo transition or gender affirmation. That's a complex process that can be all sorts of things, whether medically transitioning through hormones and surgery, legally just updating your driver's license and documents to reflect your correct gender or sex, changing your name or pronouns and the way you're addressed, changing your dress, all sorts of things from social to medical to legal. That can be a long process lasting years. That can be something done privately, something done loudly. It's different for every single person. You'll hear the terms thrown around transgender woman and transgender man. The easy way to remember who they are is that transgender women are women and transgender men are men. So a transgender woman is someone who is assigned male at birth and now is a woman. A transgender man is someone assigned female at birth and is now a man. There are also non-binary people and gender non-conforming people, which don't fit into those broad bubbles that we usually think of as the gender binary. They can be a combination of male and female. They can be anywhere in between. It's really a spectrum. They can be agender. Some people have personal identifications that don't fit in any of those classifications, and those people are all valid too. And just to touch on the final piece, which we probably should have started with, is that pronouns are words that we use to describe people without using their proper names. Things like, this is Melanie's presentation and she is giving it right now. She would be the pronoun in that sentence. So he, she, they, less popular ones with people can be it for objects and things like that. We use pronouns all the time, and they are really helpful in validating people's identities and being respectful in general. Next slide. So again, that's kind of where we are, where things have been. We're really pushing for gender justice and gender equality, as well as the identity to self-determine and be who you are. And really the idea behind that is that people should be able to bring their whole selves, whatever identities they have and whatever ways intersectionality plays into that. We want people to be their whole selves, to be who they are and to be happy in that section or in who they are. And then equally accepted into society because of that. Next slide. To get a little bit more into statistics, on test calls with people calling shelters to find out where they would house trans women seeking access to those shelters, 30% were willing to put them with women, which is trans women are women, which is where they belong. 13% decided that they should be in isolation or housed with men, which can be dangerous for all sorts of reasons. The 21% were flat out refused shelter based on their gender identity, whereas 21% didn't know what to do and were really questioning it. And then the last 15% were unreachable and not contacted, but not really part of the statistics. Next slide. And all of that leads to disparities across the board. So for cisgender adults, 49% who are unhoused are unsheltered. For transgender adults, 63% of those unhoused are unsheltered. And then when you get into gender nonconforming and non-binary people, 80% are not sheltered of the unhoused. So you can see that these discrepancies are huge across the board. Based on gender identity and gender expression can really change how you're treated. And so that's not the only case. That's not the only thing. As we've talked about, there's all sorts of protected classes that are discriminated against and we'll continue to discuss. But that's a few examples of how this impacts people on the ground.
Thank you so much, Melanie. So next we'll go into the existing rules. And just before we do that, we'll talk a little bit about the background in when HUD first established the Equal Access Rule, which took place in 2012. So HUD first established the Equal Access Rule then, and HUD stated that all HUD-funded programs must be administered regardless of marriage status, sexual orientation, or gender identity. So it was really important in establishing that all of these HUD-funded programs could not discriminate on the basis of marital status, sexual orientation, or gender identity. However, the rule kind of fell short because it did not specifically include protections for single-sex facilities with shared sleeping areas or bathrooms. So later on in 2016, HUD expanded that rule to facilities with shared sleeping areas and bathrooms. HUD reviewed a lot of national research showing that transgender and gender nonconforming individuals continued to experience violence, harassment, and discrimination when attempting to access housing or housing assistance. And we will go further into the details of the 2016 rule, but in a nutshell, HUD basically stated that the requirement was that placements should be made in accordance with a person's gender identity, as opposed to their sex assigned at birth or somebody's perception of that person's identity. And the rule also prohibited providers from asking intrusive questions about the person's gender identity or anatomy. So most recently, on July 24th of this year, HUD published a new proposed rule titled Making Admission or Placement Determinations Based on Sex in Facilities Under Community Planning and Development Housing Programs. So this rule definitely shook up, the community because it basically would dismantle all protections from the 2016 rule. The proposed rule would allow providers to establish a policy that considers a person's sex for purposes of determining accommodation within shelters. And it states that providers could consider a range of factors such as privacy, safety, practical concerns, even religious beliefs, or any other relevant considerations, including an individual's sex as reflected in their official government documents. Next slide. Also troublesome is that the rule would allow policies that determine an individual's sex based on good faith belief. So essentially, under the proposed rule, reasonable considerations to establish a good faith belief could include, but are not limited to, a combination of factors such as a person's height, the presence or not, but not the absence of facial hair, the presence of an Adam's apple, or other physical characteristics that could be indicative of a person's biological sex. So this is really troublesome because a good faith belief is completely subjective, and it's solely determined by, you know, whoever happens to be working and whoever's involved in intake or enrollment on that day. And the most obvious is that it completely ignores the client's gender identity. I'm going to turn it over to Will, who will address the ability to submit public comments regarding the proposed rule. And the deadline happens to be today.
Thanks, Melissa. So just briefly to say, and I think you covered this really well, Melissa, but like that 2020 rule is just like barefaced transphobia. Like that is not something that we can allow to stand. And it's something that, you know, going back to the statistics that Melanie was mentioning, like if that goes through, that means that more people will be on the street or housed with folks that they may not be comfortable with or not in accordance with their self-determination and their gender. And so I just want to speak on behalf of Bar High and be clear that we're not representing anyone else in this, but for Bar High, we've identified this rule as something that really cannot go through and is really detrimental to health equity. And so I wanted to raise, as Melissa mentioned, the comment deadline is actually today. And comments really do matter. This we've seen with public charge legislation and other things like this, like when people across the country really rise up and say this will not do. We stand opposed to this. We can stop some of these things. So Erica, if you could put the link in the chat, I wanted to just like offer the opportunity for folks to submit comments if you'd like today. You can do it in the background during the training. This particular site is primarily comments as individuals. So you don't necessarily have to be representing your organization or, you know, I know for many of us, we need to make sure that when we are representing our organization, we get organizational approval. This is just like myself stands opposed to this thing, and you can modify the comment in the little box. So I would really encourage you to do that. There's a different site where you can do this as organizations. If you're interested in that, let me know and we can chat it over. I don't want to take a lot more time, but this is really, really important. And we need to push back on this transphobic potential rule.
Thank you, Will. So luckily, although that proposed rule would definitely, it would essentially be government sanctioned discrimination on transgender individuals. But good news in California is that there are still local protections, state and local protections that would still apply, even if that rule ends up being finalized. So just to clarify, that 2020 proposed rule is still a proposed rule. You have the ability to submit comments up to today. The 2016 rule is still in effect and must be complied with. In addition to that, there are state and local protections that must be adhered to as well. And I'll touch on that briefly. On the next slide, we'll discuss the state guidelines. So there's a couple laws that protect against discrimination. The Fair Employment and Housing Act includes unlawful discrimination and harassment because of sex, gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation. In addition, the UNRRA Civil Rights Act applies to services that are offered to public and provide public accommodation. It also includes protections against discrimination based on sex, which includes gender, and gender includes a person's gender identity and gender expression. In addition, there are some local guidelines as well. Under the existing Contra Costa written standards, it states that all COC and ESG funded programs must provide equal access to housing, services, and accommodations in accordance with an individual's gender identity. And it's defined as, a gender identity is defined as the gender with which a person identifies, regardless of the sex assigned to that person at birth, and regardless of the person's perceived gender identity. So programs may not ask intrusive questions about gender or require proof through documentation, and program eligibility must be determined without regard to actual or perceived sexual orientation, gender identity, or marital status. So now we'll go back and discuss the rule that is still in effect today, which is the 2016 rule. Some key changes to that rule from the 2012 rule was that it clarified that gender identity is wholly self-identified and separate from any legal gender and anything that is identified in official documents. The rule prohibits intrusive questioning and requests for documentation, and requires updates to policies and procedures to reflect this. So the first part of that is that gender identity is wholly self-determined. Once again, we've heard the definition presented before, but gender identity is the gender with which a person identifies with. And this is, once again, regardless of the sex assigned at birth or the person's perceived gender identity. In contrast to that, perceived gender identity is the gender with which a person is perceived to identify based on that person's appearance, behavior, expression, or other gender-related characteristics, or the sex assigned at birth to the individual in any identified documents. The 2016 rule established that intrusive questioning is prohibited. Therefore, providers must not ask intrusive questions regarding an individual's gender identity. This includes requests for any physical or medical evidence, anatomical information, or any medical or physical history. Providers must include in their policies and procedures and address equal access in their programs. The policies and procedures must ensure that equal access to the programs are for all individuals and their families, and provide housing, services, and accommodations in accordance with a client's gender identity. And that should be and programs should determine eligibility without regard to actual or perceived sexual orientation, gender identity, or marital status. With regard to the rules in facilities with shared sleeping or bathing areas, placements in these facilities should be made based on an individual's gender identity. Providers must take any non-discriminatory steps that are necessary and appropriate to address privacy concerns by residents. For example, if there is a transgender man that comes to you and says that he feels uncomfortable showering in the congregate bathroom that has no stalls or curtains, the appropriate response to that is to try and make changes to the showering area to greater ensure privacy for everyone. It would be inappropriate to ask him to shower at a different time than anyone else. Another example of a non-discriminatory step, if you have both men and women's multi-stall bathrooms and a single stall bathroom, and a client is uncomfortable You should talk to them about what their options are, and ask them which option they would be most comfortable with. And that one of those options could be offering them to use the single stall bathroom, or using the bathroom at a different time, but it shouldn't be, you know, a requirement that they do that. And then finally, facility admissions, occupancy, and operating policies must be updated to ensure compliance. So in the next few slides, we will discuss how the equal access rule is applied at various stages when a client comes and enters into the system. So first, in outreach, engagement, and assessment, providing equal access to the clients really means a few things. For example, right away accepting the name and gender given by the individual. Also using the preferred pronoun as indicated by the individual. And if for some reason, based on the rules or eligibility, if an ID is required, you should still use the individual's current gender identity as provided by the client and not indicated on what is written on the ID. So this is really important to ensure that the clients feel comfortable and respected, and that might lead to them offering, you know, really helpful information as part of their assessment. In enrollment, what providing equal access looks like is providing a confidential area to describe services that the client may want to access to ensure the client's confidentiality. It also means not asking about the client's sex assigned at birth. And if your program or project has services that are based on gender, it's important to accept the client whose gender expression does not fit the stereotypical gender expression. And if a client is non-binary, once again, discuss all the different housing options to them and ask them what they would be most comfortable with. Equal access in unit and bed assignment means really quickly resolving any conflicts. For example, if there is one client that is harassing another, it's really important to step in and resolve that quickly to ensure that the transgender client feels safe. Also, it's important to model appropriate respectfulness and take action to coach different clients that express verbal and nonverbal disrespect. It's important to provide confidential space to allow clients to discuss issues related to harassment or other concerns connected to their current gender expression. And then finally, in ongoing service provision, it's really important to recognize that the client has a right to access all services for which they are eligible, regardless of their gender identity or gender expression. It's also important to correct other clients' misperceptions that they have regarding transgender individuals in order to create a safe environment for all. It's important to correct their misperceptions that for some reason that particular gender expression creates a safety risk. And then also, it's very important to ensure that all clients understand that verbal and physical bullying will not be tolerated. And that kind of connects back to the Fair Housing Act rules regarding anti-harassment as well. Essentially, ensuring equal and safe access to housing and services means building cultural competency and inclusion throughout the whole organization. And expectations should be clear and consistent at every level. This starts from the written policies and procedures, and it continues to staff training, supervision of staff, It also includes communication of expectations to clients, ensuring other clients are aware and understand that harassment will not be tolerated. It also shows up in modeling respectful behavior in day-to-day interactions with clients, and making sure that those written procedures with respect to harassment or safety concerns are implemented appropriately. To summarize this section, there's a few key takeaways. Although HUD's new proposed rule permits providers to consider an individual's sex when determining accommodation within shelters, the 2016 rule is still in effect. And even if the HUD proposed rule is finalized, California law and local standards still require that providers provide accommodation in accordance with an individual's gender identity. Once again, gender identity is self-determined. And then we want to emphasize that equal access is the baseline requirement. We should be, working to go above and beyond the equal access rule to create a safe, affirming, and welcoming environment for all clients. We're now going to jump into a different section, which will go over tools to disrupt bias and discrimination. First in this section will be Cassie.
Thanks, Melissa. Yep, perfect. Thanks, Amanda. I just wanted to bring it back to Contra Costa County's commitment to equity and everything that we've talked about today. So we believe that everyone should have a home, and we're committed to ending homelessness for people experiencing homelessness today in our community, and we're working proactively to ensure that any future housing crisis is uncommon, brief, and non-recurring. And we're doing this, as I mentioned earlier, through all of this work is grounded through 3 principles. So that's transparency, data-driven decision-making, and equity. It's important for our system to be constantly engaging in this cycle of learning and implementing and evaluating and improving our policies and practices, procedures, communications, valuations, decision-making, and engagement to ensure that individuals' racial and ethnic or other identity markers don't determine how they fare in our system. And we can do this through participating in trainings such as this one today so that we can understand and implement the laws, equitable practices, and strategies to address these issues within our system of care. So today's training is an annual requirement for the system and for all homeless service providers in Contra Costa County. It's one of many ways that H3 is planning to ensure the ongoing practice of equity by our system and providers to ensure equitable and successful outcomes and journeys through our system. So one of the tools I want to talk about first is the grievance process. So there are grievances and complaints can be made by clients, provider agencies, or other parties who are expressing dissatisfaction with the COC. So there are 3 pieces to the grievance process. First is submitting a grievance. To submit a grievance, an individual must submit this in writing, and that can be submitted to me, the COC manager, at the email address that's on your screen. The next step is investigating grievances. So once a grievance is submitted in writing, I'll take a look at what has been submitted and determine based on the grievance the appropriate parties that need to be contacted to start investigating the grievance. And I'll bring in the appropriate parties and collect any necessary documents. For example, if this is related to the coordinated entry system, I'll bring in Shelby, who's on the call today, and we'll discuss the issue and work to come up with solutions that best fit. The final piece is resolving grievances. So it'll first be up to the provider to resolve the complaint or grievance. And if a solution can't be reached, I'll work with individuals and the appropriate individuals, and we'll provide recommendations. And if necessary, we'll bring in the oversight committee to provide additional recommendations. Resolutions could be recommendations on how the agency can work with the complainant to address the issue, or if necessary, it could look like addressing and reassessing or reprioritizing the complainant for housing or services, censoring an agency, withdrawing funding, or contacting law enforcement, depending on the content of the grievance. So again, please send anything to the email address on the screen, and it'll come to me. And now I'm going to send it over to Melissa, and she's going to talk about what to do with issues beyond what we can address and how it connects to monitoring.
Thank you, Cassie. So if you can go back to the last slide. So in addition to the grievance process, anyone can also submit violations and complaints to HUD directly. So they can file a complaint with HUD via their online portal, phone, or email. The link is provided there in the slides. In addition, for equal access violations, anyone can file a complaint with the California Department of Fair Employment and Housing. Next slide. So in addition, compliance with fair housing and equal access will be part of required monitoring. Monitoring will be piloted by home base in Contra, Costa in the next month or so. After that piloting phase, all COC funded projects will eventually be required to participate in monitoring. And once again, it's important to adhere to the fair housing rules and equal access rules, because that will be part of that monitoring process. Now I'm going to turn it over to Melanie to discuss addressing challenging injustices at work.
Thank you. So there are a lot of different ways you can challenge injustices at work. And we've heard that it can be really difficult to confront somebody you know when you see something that's unjust going on. This is just one of many strategies. It's called heart, head, and hand. It's pretty easy to remember, and so hopefully you'll find it useful. But speak from the heart, use your head for intellect and evidence, and then take action with your hands is the basis. For heart, you should establish rapport and seek empathy with your listeners and connect with them. Assume good intentions and speak from yours. So you can say something like, I know we both care about helping our clients access housing, and build on that. Once you have laid that groundwork and have the rapport and connection, you can then start using evidence to show why it's important and how to deal with it. We'll lay the ground of how to deal with it. Appeal to their logic and their rational ideas, structures as they are and as you would like them to be. But an example could be, some of our clients face additional barriers. Did you know that? And then you could go into statistics about the situation that you're specifically talking about. And then the final step is to take action to change it. Take advantage of the good intentions and good nature of your coworkers. You know them, you know what they care about and how to do it. And you can say something like, if we're going to help all of our clients access housing, we need to make sure to consider and include whatever the issue you're talking about is. And then, are you willing to join me in that? And then once you have gotten their support and everybody is kind of knows they're working together for the same thing, you can take actions to correct and move forward. And I forgot that we included a quote, but Audre Lorde, it's not our differences that separate us, but our reluctance to recognize those differences and to deal effectively with the distortions which have resulted from ignoring and misnaming of those differences. Yeah, I'll just kind of leave that to stand on its own.
Thank you, Melanie. So now we're going to break up again into smaller breakout sessions. We will be working through some role play scenarios that will be linked in the chat. Your group will be around 4 to 6 people, and we're going to ask that you choose 3 role play scenarios that are most applicable to you or that you're most interested in. We're running a little bit short on time, so instead of 25 minutes, you'll have about 20 minutes to get through this, and we'll try to return to the larger group at around 3:20. Erica, could you provide that link in the chat?
Yes.
We'll likely need to provide it as well once we break out. So if everyone can click on that link now so that you can have access to the document before we break out into the smaller groups, that'd be great. All right, welcome back, everyone. I hope you found that exercise to be helpful, and I hope you were able to have some interesting discussions and learn from each other. Would anyone like to share some key takeaways from going through that exercise? Feel free to share out loud. Go ahead.
So for me, I think, it was only 2 of us, but we did most of the scenarios, and the 2 things that I took from it is that even though you might understand or know what the laws are in certain situations, that is always good to be able to have quick and easy access if you don't feel that you're really abreast to what those laws are saying, like in the scenario with the binary gender client. I think that was number 7.
Yeah, great, thank you. Would anyone else like to share? Feel free to also share in the chat. We'll also be linking to essentially like an answer key, some sample answers to those role play scenarios in the chat, and we'll be providing that in the materials that we send to you after the training as well. You can go to the next slide. So a couple concluding exercises, hoping that you guys can all take 3 minutes to reflect on these questions and write them down, and then include one of the action items in the chat box, really focusing on things that you learned in the training and the steps that you could take to advance racial equity and equal access in your actions that you take every day as an individual, and some actions that you can take as an organization as well. Great. Thank you so much for sharing, Faith. She says, as an individual, you'll strive to be more compassionate and be aware of all your biases. That's a great one. And Daniel's committed to learning the laws and rules to take advantage of the trainings and discuss issues with others. Thank you for your comment, Soon. Hopefully I'm saying that right. Education is key in being well versed in the laws and protections set in place. Will make educating landlords, coworkers, case managers, clients, etc. much easier when issues come up. Definitely agree with all those comments so far. Feel free to keep popping those in the chat box. Thank you for sharing your comment, Angela. To be accountable for your actions and create a supportive and helpful environment, and to continue with education. So thank you to everyone who included their action items in the chat box. We're going to wrap up with another poll to assess your learning from the training. That should pop up on your screen now. And then if everyone can take a minute to click on the link in the chat box, it's an additional evaluation. It's just actually two quick questions. If you can just click on that and take a minute to fill that out before we wrap things up. We really appreciate everyone's participation in the training today. We hope that you learned a lot from it. And once again, as a reminder, we will be sending you the PowerPoint and the answers to the role play scenarios after the training in your email. And thank you for spending the last 2.5 hours with us. It actually went by pretty fast, so hope you all enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody, also from the Bar High team.
Thank you,
Really nice spending time with you.
Melissa, for your in-depth training.
Yeah, for sure.
Thank you guys for your in-depth background knowledge.
Thank you, Bar High and Home Base, for the training, and thanks everyone for joining today.